Right before this NHL season started, I went through every single team and predicted where they'd finish in the standings this year. Now that we know which teams missed and made the NHL playoffs and how many points every single team got, I wanted to take a look back at my standings from before the season started and see how poorly or how good they've aged and grade all of them from A+ down to F. So make sure you watch till the end as we go through all my standings predictions to see how they age today, and make sure that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this all throughout the year. Now, before we get started today, I want to first talk about today's sponsor in Exter. Now, if you're like me, you've probably had a crappy old wallet that you've had for 10 years that's completely falling apart. But with Exter, their wallets are finally crafted and made to last, which I appreciate. Now, Exter does have your old-fashioned leather wallets, but they also have aluminum ones which feel solid and sturdy. My favorite part about the Exter wallets, though, is just how easy it is to use. Just use this clamp on the side and your cards pop out just like that. Plus, if you want to store money or anything on the side, you got the Exter strap as well to keep it protected. But on top of being RFID protected, the pop-up mechanism being so slim as well in its design, one of the most useful features as well is the Finder card. With this Finder card, all you need to do is pair it to your phone, and whether it gets lost or stolen, you'll be able to find it again. I'm really glad that Exter sent me this new wallet though, because my old one is going to need a retirement home here soon. If you guys want to upgrade to an Exter wallet just like me, you can enjoy 30% off until May 19th just using promo code GRAVITEH, GRAVITEH, at checkout to get an additional 10% savings as well. A big thank you to Exter Wallets for sponsoring today's video, and let's get right back into it. Now, let's start out today with our look back at the standings predictions with the Pacific, and I think I did okay with the Pacific. Not great, not good, but let's get into it. Of course, starting us out is the Edmonton Oilers, and for some reason, I thought this would be the year the Oilers would actually win the Pacific Division. It seems like this is never going to happen at this point. There's always something that comes up, some injury or some other team that gets more hot that ends up surpassing the Oilers in the end. They ended up getting 101 points on the year, finishing third in the Pacific. Definitely not close to number one, though, with Vegas easily taking that top spot. I think a big reason for that decrease is especially the injuries that we saw, a bunch of them throughout the roster. You had, of course, Evander Kane out for all of the season. You had a player like Connor McDavid also banged up for a pretty big chunk of the year as well. So that definitely limited the upside the Oilers actually had. In terms of the actual grade itself, I'm going to give it a C+. It wasn't horribly bad. It wasn't horribly good either. Obviously off in terms of the position of the standings, but only 6 points off. It's okay. It's not great, but I'll take it for now. Now, we get a lot better in the prediction aspect here because at number 2, this is where I had the LA Kings, and I've had them finishing with 102 points in the year, finishing second in the Pacific, and this actually got really close. As for where the LA Kings finished, they had a pretty great run, getting 48 wins, 105 points in 82 games. Obviously, getting close in the points department is pretty important, but also getting the exact position in the division, I think, is pretty important for the predictions as well. So I got the second place prediction right, and only 3 points off. I will take that. One of the big reasons why I saw the Kings doing so well coming into the year was the balance on that team. So much depth, especially in the forward group, that I thought would propel them throughout the regular season. And even though I had some question marks about the goaltending and Darcy Kemper, I thought returning back to the Western Conference, returning back to the Kings where he had some major success, could have been interesting, and I don't even think I predicted him to be even close to this good. He's been terrific. As for the actual grade itself, I'm going to give my prediction an A on LA. I think I did quite well. Obviously, the points aren't exact, so it's not going to get an A+, but all things considered, I will take it. It's good that I was correct on the LA Kings because after that, it gets pretty interesting. At number 3, this is where they have the Vancouver Canucks. And of course, the first time I'm actually confident in the Canucks doing well, they decide to crap the bed. Now, coming into the year, I don't think it was all that surprising to have the Canucks in a playoff spot. I maybe could have had them more in a wild card position, but I did have them as the last playoff team in the Pacific. I just thought the balance in the roster was quite nice, and we'd actually see players like Pettersson and JT Miller get along, which was wishful thinking. On the ice, though, I thought we'd see some success there still, and Quinn Hughes doing what he does best, leading that team to the promised land, but unfortunately just wasn't meant to be. The injuries throughout the roster, and really the writing was on the wall when you had Thatcher Demko coming into the season injured again. So it was just another brutal season after all the hope that they were able to come together with last year, and the Canucks are back to square one, which is never what you want to be at. I would be genuinely shocked if that team once again rebounds next year, because I think the roster itself is going to have some major issues going forward, but the Canucks always seem to do crazy things, so we'll see what happens there. As for the actual prediction itself, I'm going to give them a straight C. For all the problems the Canucks had, they still finished with 90 points, which is still pretty respectable. Obviously not good enough to make the playoffs, but only 5 points out, I think is fine. Now, it doesn't get any better for me because at number 4, this is where I had the Vegas Golden Knights. And it was one of my bolder predictions coming into the year that the Golden Knights would miss the playoffs, but it was for a few pretty key reasons. The first one, and the main thing that I think was completely corrected throughout the season, was the goal scoring. Especially on the wings, I was really concerned how that scoring was going to keep up. I still liked players like Dorofiev, and obviously players like Aman Barbashev had some good moments for Vegas, but I really thought the depth could be lacking for them, but it really wasn't. A player like Dorofiev came out and scored like 35 goals or something. Absolutely amazing production there. But players like Brett Howden and Keegan Kolzar, and you have a player like Tanner Pearson scoring 12 goals for some reason out of nowhere, reviving his career. Vegas' structure and their dependability, and especially their coaching, again, was able to prevail. And honestly, I should have seen that coming. Bruce Cassidy is still one of the best coaches out there, and I think this season for Vegas is another big reason to prove that. And even if the depth was an issue at times, a player like Jack Eichel having one of his best seasons ever and one of the more underrated seasons in the NHL this year also was a big reason to get them there. I mean, 50 wins was by far way better than anything I was expecting out of them, and the Golden Knights again are proving why they're such a well-oiled machine year after year. Really, there's no other grade I can give this prediction besides a straight F. Obviously, of course, Vegas rising up and not just making the playoffs, but also winning the Pacific Division, looking as good as they have been. I did not expect that whatsoever, but really, I probably should have. Now, getting us started with the second half of my Pacific Division predictions, this is where I had the Seattle Kraken, and this wasn't all too far off, but I did see the Kraken being a little bit more competitive than they were. They ultimately finished with just 35 wins and 76 points, 10 points below what I predicted them to be at. I'm going to give the prediction a D+. I thought the Kraken would be a little bit better in the Pacific Division especially, and a little bit more of a competent team. Especially with some of the free agent additions they made. I would have hoped that they would be a more competent team, but they still kind of baffle me in terms of their direction and what they're trying to be. Hopefully, though, they can continue to get younger and hopefully build up that young core, which is still looking pretty solid. But I'm going to give the prediction a D+. Next up, we go into the Anaheim Ducks, and this is kind of the reverse Seattle Kraken. The Ducks actually were a little more competent than I expected them to be, finishing with 80 points this year, which I think is a miracle considering the strength of competition in that Pacific Division this year. But the Ducks did take some strides, I would say, and hopefully with a new coach next year that actually decides to give the youth more confidence and more consistency, we can see the Ducks take another bigger step. But I'm glad to see the Ducks being a little bit better than I predicted because I just want them to be competent at this point. I want them to actually be competitive because it's been so long since that's been the case. I'm going to give this prediction a B+. I predicted them to be 6 in the division. They ultimately finished there, and I was points off. So everything considered, I think I did pretty well with the Ducks and the Kings. But as has been the case of all of my Pacific Division predictions, as soon as I get one really right, I get one very wrong. Because in the next place spot, this is where it had the Calgary Flames finishing with 69 points on the year. And this was definitely one of my worst ones. As we saw, the Flames were the best team to miss the playoffs, finishing with 96 points and 41 wins. I think they're one of the best teams to ever miss the playoffs in terms of total points, or at least right up there. They're a team that has proved me wrong in terms of their competency, their competitiveness throughout every single game. They were a team that never backed down, and that was great to see out of them. There's been a lot of conversation around the Flames and them not going in a complete rebuild, but I think they've done, honestly, a pretty good job of the picks they made. You had a player like Matt Coronado outside the top 10, Zane Parekh at the position they got him at, and even a player like Dustin Wolf, who was one of the main Calder contenders this year, being a 7th round pick. The Flames are proving that you don't have to go into complete full-scale teardown to still get good young value, and I'm glad to see that get rewarded. Though I was definitely wrong in that aspect, and wrong about them going into full rebuild of the trade deadline too, because that definitely did not happen either. And with the Flames and my prediction getting a D- there, let's move on to the San Jose Sharks, the last team in the Pacific, who I saw finishing with 64 points, which was, I guess, really optimistic for this Sharks team because they finished with 52 points, just 5 points better than their disastrous 2024 season. It's really good. The Sharks have good vibes and they have good young rookies because if they didn't, things would be looking rough. But the Sharks do have them and they have a good future still coming up, especially after this year's draft where they're going to get even more young talent. But still, 12 points off is pretty brutal. I did get the exact position, them getting 8th in the Pacific Division, but let's be honest, who didn't have them 8th in the Pacific Division? So as of right now, I'm going to give the prediction a D+ and move on from the Pacific. Now, starting us out in the Central Division right at the very top, this is where I'm having my favorite team in the Dallas Stars, getting 106 points on the year. Now, this one was so close to being perfect because the Stars did finish with 106 points on the year, but of course, Winnipeg Jets had their terrific year and winning the President's Trophy, put the Stars outside of that #1 spot in the Central. So about as close as I could possibly get to an A+, ripped away from it. But I will take that straight A whenever I can get it because next up, Oh no. Yeah, this is where I had the Nashville Predators, and you guys know I was a pretty big fan of what the Preds were cooking before last season, and I was one of the few people out there saying that they make the playoffs. They ultimately did, surpassing so many people's expectations. This year, though, it didn't really work so well being optimistic in them. They got not 101 points in 82 games, a lot less than that. In fact, they didn't even get 70 points. They finished with 68, and honestly, I think my predictions would have looked good if it weren't for just a couple of teams that I picked way too high, Nashville being among them. So many different things went wrong for this Predators team, man. I mean, that huge free agency spend they had seemed to completely ruin the chemistry and the momentum they had going on, made them much more of a one-dimensional, older, slower team, and just did not work for the systems they had. You also have the goaltending that was all over the place, the defense that was just continuing to crumble, and everything that really put into place last year at the right times came crumbling down. Really no other grade to give this but an F. And it didn't get much better in my top three because at my third place spot, this is where I had the Utah Hockey Club. Now, this was one of my bold predictions heading into the year that Utah would rise in their first season with all the momentum they had, all of the excitement, and make the NHL playoffs, and not even just make it, be top three in the Central. Now, I think a big reason why this didn't happen was because of the crucial injuries they had to the defense. That was one of the main points of contention before the season. They went out in the offseason and tried to fix those issues, but you had the injuries to Sergachev, injuries to Marino, and that was really, I think, pretty jarring for that defense to go back and forth like that. It was just a major issue throughout the year, the consistency in the lineup. And even though you had great players still like Blaine Keller and Logan Cooley, and even Velmelka had a good season in goal, it just wasn't enough to get there in the end. But they still had a respectable year, still 89 points, and not too far off in terms of the actual point totals. So even though Utah, I think, did take a jump in terms of their play, it wasn't nearly as much as I was expecting, and especially going from 3rd to 6th in the actual Central Division leaves them with just a D+ in the grade here. Now, I'm going to lump my next two wildcard teams in here with the Colorado Avalanche and the Winnipeg Jets, my two wildcard teams in the West. I had Colorado finishing with 98 points to get that first wildcard spot, with Winnipeg at number 2 with 94. Now, Colorado was a team that I was kind of debating whether they missed the playoffs. I saw some pretty obvious issues with the depth and the goaltending, but of course, we saw the Avs, like we talked about through the last couple of weeks, really making those big-time additions throughout the season, especially Mackenzie Blackwood, who I think is really not just changing the Avs' fortunes for the regular season, but also the playoffs as well. But Winnipeg was definitely a much worse prediction, I would say, because they're a team that obviously went on to win the President's Trophy. I think for them, I was kind of just debating how strong that, but really besides the top line would be if a player like Nikolai Ehlers would come back to help and be a major contributor for them, but he was able to do that. And the defense especially, I was kind of concerned how much they'd come together. It was a little bit on the older side. We had players like Dylan Sandberg coming in and really having breakout seasons for them. So really, so many things were able to come back together for them in the regular season again, and they just were able to be a strong contender and a stronger contender than they've ever been, which is great to hear. But I definitely underestimated just the power of the top end players, as well as the depth that was able to come up for them. In terms of the grades, I'm going to give the Avs pick a B+, not too far off in terms of the point totals. They finished with 102 points and 3rd in the Central, but the Jets was way off. They finished with 116 points, more than 20 points above. Definitely one of my worst predictions. Now to number 6, and this is where the St. Louis Blues go. This was actually looking pretty strong for a while there. Before the Blues had this miraculous push, they were seeming like they were going to finish around 82, 85, and as I predicted, 87 points. But they, of course, finished with 96 points on the year, rising up to get that second wild card spot, and what a run they had. I mean, I didn't think that they would hire Jim Montgomery, one of the most underrated coaches out there mid-season, so that definitely changed things up a bit. But you, of course, had to factor in the youth coming into the roster and just how influential they were. I didn't see the rookie season that Zach Bolduc is having before the season. I didn't think Dylan Holloway, even though I liked him, would have the season he is having up to this point. So there was a lot of major factors and contributors for this Blues team that propelled them in a lot of big ways that made my prediction a little bit worse. Not the worst prediction in the world, but they finished around the same spot, so I'm going to give them a C-. Now, finishing us up in the Central Division, we got back-to-back Ds. We got Minnesota at the 7th spot, and this one did look pretty rough. They finished 4th in the Central, finished with 97 points, really vastly outperforming my expectations. The big thing was my concerns about the goaltending really being alleviated with Philip Gustafsson rebounding back to that great level we saw in 2023, which was a huge revelation for a Minnesota team that was injured throughout a bulk of this season, was still able to come together, though, and kudos to them, because that was great to see. Chicago, no real surprise. They, again, finished in 8th in the Central Division, but they were quite a lot less competitive and competent than thought they would be. I thought the free agency would make a little more of a difference, but ultimately it was the same old mid Chicago Blackhawks we've seen over the past few years. Please don't make me talk about my Metro predictions. It's not going to end well, man. Yeah, as you can see, I had the New York Rangers winning the Metro division, and this was for a few reasons. Obviously, the Rangers before this season were still a pretty consistent contender, and even my issues with their 5-on-5 play and the speed never really seemed to hold them back until this season, where everything came crumbling down for them. A big reason for that, I saw Igor Shesterkin having a terrific season, potentially a Vezina Trophy winning year. I thought he'd be right up there alongside players like Jacob Markstrom, potentially Dustin Wolf, but I thought Igor Shesterkin would be terrific. I still thought we would have good seasons out of players like Kreider and Zibanejad, and complete seasons out of players like Ryan Lindgren, who ultimately got traded in the end. So many different factors for the Rangers kept them back from making the playoffs, but honestly, it was a kick in the nuts that I think they quite frankly deserved. This roster needs so much change, and hopefully they'll actually make it, because finishing 85 points is laughable. Speaking of laughable, I predicted Laugh to have a pretty good season, and that did not happen. So that definitely limited the upside, and so many different reasons for the Rangers where it came crashing down. But hopefully we'll see them actually change direction, because quite frankly, they need it. My second place prediction was a little bit better. Of course, I have the New Jersey Devils finishing with 101 points. The Metro was just a strange one, man. You had New Jersey third in the Metro, but they had 91 points on the year, which is just insane to me that we would see a team in the Metro with that low amount of point totals. But still, I predicted New Jersey to make the playoffs. Not quite there in terms of the point totals, but still a fine prediction. But of course, the big injuries to them and the inconsistencies in goal and the defense limited their upside. But I think next year, once they're back and hopefully fully healthy, things should go a little bit better. Now, this is where things get interesting, because at number 3, this is where I had the Washington Capitals. And especially when we're talking about standings predictions from the last year, I think the thing that bit a lot of people was the Washington Capitals and just how good they were. Now, I thought the Capitals would actually be quite good heading into this season, but of course, not as good as they ultimately became. But they were one of the teams where I actually did predict right here. And in the Capitals case, they of course won the Eastern Conference, or at least in the regular season got the most amount of points, won the Metro Division, just a well-oiled machine all throughout the year. The youth was impeccable. The goaltending was massive for them. I thought for a lot of key reasons, especially the offseason additions of players like Waugh and Jickerman as well to the defense, we would see the Caps continue to be a strong team. But man, they were stronger than I think anybody ever predicted, and that is so much fun to see. The Caps being competitive and in a fresh new way is something that I didn't quite expect, but I am here for. So even though I was one of the people that actually thought the Capitals would do well and actually were a little bit right about them, they still exceeded my expectations, which just shows how surprising this Caps team is, but I'm going to give them a B- here. Now, this next prediction really just shows how different the Metro Division was to what I actually was predicting, because at the 4th place spot and the first wildcard spot, I had the Carolina Hurricanes finishing 99 points. Now, the interesting part about this is I actually got the point totals right. The Canes finished with 99 points on the year, but of course, we're second in the Metro instead with that number. So a little bit of a difference there, but I still saw the Canes being a good team, a well-oiled machine, Rob Brindamore still being one of the more competent and consistent coaches in the league, and the Canes finding a way, like they always do with the strong roster they have, to make the playoffs. The playoffs are always a question mark with the team, but I think the regular season, at this point, they've proved themselves to always be in the mix, always be a competitive team, and I think they've proved themselves up to that type of level. I was expecting a similar result like last year, but I think the Canes are still one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference and continue to be. Now let's talk about the start of that second half in the Metro. We go on to the New York Islanders and the Philadelphia Flyers, two teams that I definitely overestimated in terms of my expectations. The Islanders were a big one that I was a little bit wrong on, 10-point difference, and they ultimately finished 6th in the Metro. A big reason for this was I saw Sorokin having a better year than I did. I didn't really expect the major injuries to players like Barzal as well. You could never really predict stuff like that, but of course it did affect the Islanders quite a bit. And of course we saw them going in a bit of a selling direction at the deadline, which I honestly didn't really think the Islanders would ever do considering the way they run things. Of course, selling players like Brock Nelson in the end, which led to some struggles down the stretch. But still, the Islanders were never this most competitive team in the world, but they were still in the mix towards the very end, so at least there's that, but definitely not in terms of the point totals nearly as high. I think the Metro was definitely the division I overestimated the most in terms of raw point totals, and it's showing here. Now going on to the Flyers, and they're an interesting one because they're another team I overestimated for, but it's interesting the way the season went down for them because they finished with 76 points, finished last in the Metro Division, which is pretty shocking to see, especially with how much Tortorella had gotten more than the sum of their parts in seasons prior. But I think this season, it just wasn't coming together. He wasn't able to get more juice out of this roster that just didn't have more juice in it. And of course, he ended up leaving the team, which I think was the right decision in the end. The Flyers, I think, need to go in a more youthful, more skill-based direction, and I think this is the start in doing so. Hopeful. Now moving on to the Pittsburgh Penguins at that 7th place spot, and this was another team that I got so close to getting exactly right because I had them finishing with 78 points. They finished with 80, but I had them finishing 7th in the Metro, which is where they ultimately ended up. For the Penguins, I saw them being exactly in the position they were in, still having the great performances out of players like Sidney Crosby, but so much of the depth and so much of that roster just being crumbled around them just led to a Penguins team that I didn't have much aspirations for. I wasn't a big fan of the goaltending. I wasn't a big fan of the depth and how they used those pieces, and again, it continued to be a problem. I don't know where the Penguins go from here. I think they should try to replicate that Caps model, but it's a lot easier said than done. So I think for the Penguins going forward, it will be very interesting to see what they do next. And let's go on to the Columbus Blue Jackets. And this is the team right here, man, that I am the most happy to see proving me wrong, because I think most of us probably had Columbus in that last place spot, but they rose to the 4th place position, just barely missing the playoffs with 89 points in 82 games. And what a story, man. Of course, the unfortunate passing of Johnny Gaudreau right before the season was really such a blow to that team, but look at how much they rallied around him, man. How much the youth was able to come up in so many major ways. The growth in players like Fantilli over the course of the year, players like Kent Johnson were huge. Even players and waiver claims like Dante Fabro were huge pieces for this team, and they were able to overcome some, again, pretty big goaltending hurdles, which I thought was going to be a major problem for them heading into the season. They were able to outscore those issues throughout a big chunk of this season, and it was so entertaining to watch. I think what this Columbus team proved is that they are solid for the future. They have a great foundation, and they're going to keep building upon that. And what a coaching job by Dean Evason, man. What a difficult situation for this team to be in, and to prove everybody wrong. Love to see it, man. This might be the happiest I will ever be in my entire life to give myself an F, but dang it, I love it, man. Now, if you were looking for some bad takes in today's video, if you're looking for a division that I got almost completely wrong, well, the Atlantic is going to be the division for you because, as you could probably guess by the 1st place position, I'd rather forget this one, honestly. Okay, let me explain myself, because obviously the Boston Bruins, this is probably, in terms of all of the predictions I made, the worst one out there, because especially in terms of division placement, I had the Bruins winning the Eastern Atlantic Division, which I thought was going to be a rather competitive, rather close race. They ended up finishing 8th, and I think for a pretty big reason. The Bruins just had major issues on the roster that were not overcome by the coaching this year. And that, I think, is a far cry from what we saw in seasons past with Jim Montgomery, who is now doing what he's doing with the Blues. He does miraculous work with the rosters he is given, but this year it just wasn't enough to overcome. They still have massive issues in the forward group, but to me, a big reason why I saw the Bruins doing well was still, I thought, some pretty good pieces on the defense. I saw Charlie McAvoy getting a lot more healthy than he ended up being, and I saw Jeremy Swayman having a brilliant year, but of course, he was held back from training camp, and of course, with all the contract situations there, that was not something that I predicted to happen. I thought we would see him sign, have a fully ready to go training camp, and be ready for the season. That, of course, did not happen, and I think that's a big reason why he wasn't ready and the Bruins weren't ready for the season they ultimately had. I think it's exactly the type of season the Bruins did need, just like the Rangers needed a kick in the butt. The Bruins needed exactly that same situation too, and hopefully they can get a lot younger and a lot wiser from the situation, because they're going to need it going forward. Now, moving on to my 2nd place prediction in the Atlantic, and this actually turned out pretty well. With the Florida Panthers, I ultimately predicted them to get 103 points on the year, and this wasn't all too far off. They ultimately got 98, so a little bit weaker than I was expecting, in 3rd place in the Atlantic Division, but overall, probably one of my better predictions in the Atlantic, but a pretty easy one, honestly. Which leads me on to another pretty brutal one here, because at number 3, this is where I had the Buffalo Sabres. And I pretty famously had the Sabres missing the playoffs last year, which I remember got a lot of heat, a lot of controversy. They, of course, ended up missing the playoffs. This year, though, I was actually pretty confident in the team taking some big steps and actually getting there. I thought Lindy Ruff would have a pretty big effect on the team, and the goaltending would hopefully stay consistent, but it was just kind of an inconsistent disaster all throughout the year. You had some players rising up to big levels. Tage Thompson somehow getting back to that amazing level that we saw, I think, back in 2023. He was unbelievable this season, but a lot of key players had either stumbling seasons or just inconsistencies. Guys like Owen Power had their fair share of struggles, and really the defense, again, continue to be a major disappointment. The goaltending was all over the place. Levi, of course, didn't take that next step again, which is a little bit concerning. But I saw the youth being a massive reason why we would see them propel back into the playoffs. Some of those guys worked out, some of those guys didn't, and I expected kind of a full progression of the team, which unfortunately just still hasn't come to happen. I think the writing is on the wall. They need more NHL experience. They need more leadership in that room, and I think if the Sabres don't get that again this offseason, it's going to be another brutal year coming up. I think it's so obvious what the Sabres team needs, and if they go after it, I hope to be optimistic in them again, but didn't work this time. Now, going on to the next two teams in the Atlantic, these are the two teams that finished first and second in the Atlantic Division by the end, with the Toronto Maple Leafs winning and the Tampa Bay Lightning coming in second place. These are two teams that I had in the middle of things, with the Toronto Maple Leafs being the second wildcard team in the East and Tampa Bay missing the playoffs, and both of these predictions are also pretty rough. Now, thankfully, I still had the Leafs making the playoffs, but the points prediction was pretty off, so I'm going to give it a D+ in terms of the actual prediction itself. But I saw the Leafs and a lot of the effect of the Craig Berube hiring happening in the playoffs, not so much in the regular season. A big issue for me was the goaltending and how that would factor into the regular season, how much we'd see out of Joseph Woll, how good a player like Anthony Stolarz would be as a full-time starter, and I think we got that answer pretty miraculously for Toronto, that both of these guys would be top-tier players, especially to start out the season. They were among the best goaltenders in the league. Stolarz especially finishing off especially strong. He's somebody that I think has been huge for the Leafs especially, as one of the big reasons why they were ultimately able to become a division winner in the end. But predictions-wise, didn't work out too well. And then we go on to my 5th place spot here in the Tampa Bay Lightning, just finishing the playoffs by 1 point, but the fact that I had the Lightning missing the playoffs at all was an L of a take for sure. I mean, I didn't think the defense would be as good as it was for the Bolts, but Ryan McDonagh and his return, and really being as good as he's ever been, I think, for Tampa Bay, has been a huge component of that team. Victor Hedman, I think, has had one of his better years recently. Andre Vasilevsky has gone back to an elite level after being so-so last season, which has been a major improvement for the team. But even though the depth hasn't been miraculous or anything, you've had the top-end players doing what they needed to do. So I think in Tampa Bay's respects, some of the issues I had for the team were kind of negated by just how strong the top end of the roster was. And we'll see how much that's able to factor into the playoffs this year, but it should be very interesting. But predictions wise, absolutely a D. The only reason I don't think it's worse than that is because in terms of the actual points, it wasn't completely far off, only a 7-point difference, but still, them missing the playoffs, not a good justification whatsoever. And then we go on to the last bit of the Atlantic Division, and it really sucks, man, because I really had the wrong youthful team rising up to the playoffs, because at the 6th place spot, this is where I had the Detroit Red Wings. Now, I saw them making a decent jump, but not enough of a jump to actually make the playoffs this year, like we saw play out throughout the course of the season. The issues with the inconsistent goaltending, the inconsistent defense, and the lack of strong depth continued to hurt the Detroit Red Wings. But just in a lot of ways, I think that roster has just continued to kind of plateau in ways that I don't want to see. I want to see them improve. I want to see them get better. But they just haven't been creative enough in the offseason additions they made. The amount of spending they're putting in free agency, I think, is really starting to hurt them. And we're starting to see the ramifications of that, with them being worse than even I predicted. In terms of the point totals, I wasn't too far off, with them finishing with 86 points. And they also finished 6th in the Atlantic Division too. So I'm going to give that prediction a B. But the last two definitely did not work out. I had the Ottawa Senators with 87 points, them, of course, making the NHL playoffs, which is so freaking cool to see. And also the Montreal Canadiens, who I saw finishing with 79 points, still making improvement, being a better team. But man, the improvement we saw out of both the Habs and the Senators was such a breath of fresh air. I think the big thing that I wanted to see was more blood in the more new blood, especially in the Eastern Conference, but I underestimated how much new blood we would see. And honestly, I am so glad I'm wrong, especially for the Senators and the Canadiens. Having those two teams in the playoffs just makes things so much more fun. The Senators, the big thing I was kind of concerned about was the defense, but it was a major point of improvement for the Senators this year. Players like Nick Jensen, who they traded in the Jacob Chychrun trade, really solidified things. We had the improvements of players like Thomas Chabot especially, who were so-so in my opinion, but really had breakout years this season. And a team like Montreal, even though we had their issues with the defense, a player like Lane Hudson was transformative for them. The improvements in players like Nick Suzuki every single year. The depth was actually pretty strong for them in the forward group, and the goaltending and Samuel Montembeault continue to be strong. But but especially for both of these teams, I think the big difference was those late close games, eking out those points, eking out those wins. They were the really clutch and the mature wins that they weren't able to capture in seasons prior that led them to playoff spots this season. The Sanders, it wasn't quite as surprising, but the Habs especially, the improvements they made in their young core, that's going to really be a benefit for them for years to come. So in terms of my actual standings predictions, I think I did fine and probably below average for my standards at least. There was a couple predictions I got pretty correct, pretty spot on. Nothing that was an A+ or anything, but quite a few predictions that just did not age well whatsoever, especially my division winners, man. It was rough. Really, besides Dallas, there wasn't really any team that came especially close, and that's what I'm kind of most disappointed by. But obviously, of course, there is always next year. And even though I was wrong on so many of these, that's what I love. I love being wrong on these because it means that we have surprises during the season. We have teams coming out that we never would have expected. That's what hockey is all about. And that's why hockey is so great, because it's so in the air. It can be so random. It can be so extraordinary. And that's what I love about it. But thank you guys so much for tuning in and tuning into my predictions. Look back. I want to know in the comments down below, if you guys posted your standings predictions in the comments of the last video, how did they turn out? How bad or good have they aged? And what was your predictions all throughout the league? What was your worst? What was your best prediction? Let me know your thoughts down below. Of course, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and the notification bell. And a big thank you to Extra for sponsoring today's video. But I will see you guys in the next one. Have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.